Hello everyone, this is COM 300 recitation week 6 video, and today I will review some contents that will be covered in exam 1. So today's goal is like this. First, I will share some information about exam 1, and then I'll review some contents that will be covered in exam 1. So first, for the exam 1 information, exam 1 will be on this Thursday during normal lecture time in the lecture room at the Wells Hall. And the exam 1 will consist of 40 multiple choice questions. And students should prepare a pencil, eraser, and a student ID card. And you can check exam 1 study guide and practice questions posted on B2L exam 1 Dropbox. Then next, I will review some contents covered in exam 1. So I'll review some research terminologies, 5 types of research, and how to establish causal relationship, and what is the population and sample, and 4 types of sampling techniques to get unbiased sample, and 4 levels of measurement. And then I will talk about validity and reliability, and finally, we'll talk about guidelines of how to make survey questions. First, I will talk about research terminologies. So throughout in the lecture and the recitation, we covered various terminologies about research, like for theory, concept, conceptualization, operationalization, measure, variable, and hypothesis. So just for briefly review, theory, we first talk about theory, and theory is a set of systematically related statements about relationships among concepts with the purpose of explaining some phenomena. And then we talk about concept, and concept is defined as an abstraction that describes a portion of reality. Then we talk about conceptualization is about defining the concepts, like what is happiness or what is like media use. This is the conceptualization. And then we talk about operationalization. Operationalization is to make abstract concepts in a more observable way by assigning numbers. So the operationalization or measure is the process of associating numbers with abstract concept to make it more observable. Then we talk about variable, and variable is defined as a thing like attitudes, characteristics, or behavior that changes from unit to unit, like person, social group, or unit of content. And we talk about 2 types of variables. First one is independent variable, that is variables that are presumed to have some effect or predict or explain other variables. So independent variable could be a cause of change. Also, we talk about dependent variable, and dependent variable is an observable outcome that represents a measurable effect, like consequences or effect. So when we talk about like social media could make people depressed, then the independent variable is a social media use, then the dependent variable is levels of depression. Finally, we also talk about hypothesis, which is defined as a statement about the relationship between variables. So in this way, you can review and remind some terminologies, and you can think about the definitions of those terminologies. Next, we'll go to 5 types of research. So we talk about observational studies, experiments, like surveys, content analysis, and meta-analysis. First one I want to talk here is observational studies. And observational studies is, in the observational studies, researchers observe or measure variables as they naturally occur. And in the observational studies, researchers cannot manipulate levels of independence. However, in contrast with an observational studies that look at what is happening or look at what is naturally occurring, in the experiments, researchers can manipulate the independent variable. And also in the experiments, researchers do random assignments. So randomly assign study participants into several groups. And through this random assignment, we can establish causal relationship. Why? Because through the random assignment, it is assumed that other characteristics like gender, like age or average of education level, they are assumed the same across groups because of the random assignment. Through this random assignment, we can remove a threat of confounding variable, which is the one criteria to establish causal relationship. And also in experiments, participants are randomly assigned into groups like treatment group and the control group. And treatment group, also called the experimental group, receives a treatment whose effect the researchers is interested in. However, in the control group is used to establish causal relationship by isolating the effects of an independent variable. So researchers look at treatment variable and people in the treatment group receive some kind of treatment that researchers are interested in. Then we can see the effect of or influence of treatment group compared to the control group. So in the recitation, we talk about how fact-checking messages makes people have correct beliefs. So the independent variable is receiving fact-checking messages, and then the dependent variable is beliefs about misinformation or correct or accurate beliefs. So to test this hypothesis in the experiments, participants are randomly assigned into two groups. One group received the fact-checking messages, and the other group did not receive a fact-checking message. In this context, the treatment group is a group that received the fact-checking messages because researchers have interest in this group. Another group who did not receive fact-checking messages is a control group, and the control group exists to isolate the effect of the treatment group. So this is how the experiment works. Another types of research is surveys. So you can just think about like phone interview, where a sample of people is asked some kinds of questions. Another types of research is content analysis. And content analysis is defined as systematic method of measuring component of messages. So researchers look at tags, videos, and audios and identify the characteristics of the messages. That is the content analysis. For example, researchers can look at whether news articles can be categorized as liberal-oriented, conservative-oriented, or neutral. Then researchers can investigate how liberal media outlets describe international relationships like US-South Korea relationship compared to conservative media outlets. This is what the content analysis researchers doing content analysis do. Final types of research, final one is the meta-analysis. So in the meta-analysis, researchers try to produce a quantitative summary of a number of prior studies. So for example, there are a bunch of studies about the relationship between social media and depression. And by summarizing this bunch of prior studies, we can get summary result. This is the meta-analysis. Next, we can talk about how to establish causality. So in the recitation and the lecture, we talk about three criteria to establish causal relationship. First, variables must be correlated, which means that changes in one variable should be related or associated with changes in another variable. Second, causes should take place or happens before the effect. So in the recitation, we talk about the example whether places of birth can influence attitudes towards marijuana. We say like placebos can influence attitudes towards marijuana. However, attitudes towards marijuana can determine or changes your places at birth because the cause happens before the effect, or happens before forming an attitudes towards marijuana. So the second criteria is about time order between causes and effect. Last one is relationship between independent and dependent variable should not be accounted for by a third variable or confounding variable. And in the experiment, researchers do a random assignment. And through this random assignment, we can remove a thread of third variable or confounding variable. So when these all three criteria are met or satisfied, then we can establish a causality or causal relationship between independent and dependent variables. Also, in the lecture and the recitation, we talk about population and the sample. And the population is a group of people, usually a group of people about whom we want to draw conclusions. So you can think about a whole US citizens, like 300 million people. However, in many times, we don't have enough money and time to survey all people in the population. So we draw a sample, a portion of the population, and we collect the sample and we study the characteristics of sample, like 500 people representative of US citizens. And by investigating the characteristics of the sample, we try to predict the characteristics of population. This is how the population is related to the sample. And also, so sampling is the tool or the method used to learn about population, or sampling is a tool method about how to draw a sample from a population. And in this perspective, you can also calculate the margin of error here. And in the lecture, we talk about 4 types of sampling to get unbiased sample. Systematic sampling, a simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified random sampling, and cluster sampling. These 4 types of sampling is used to get unbiased or representative samples. First, simple random sampling, you can think about generate the random numbers. So the steps of the simple random sampling is first to generate the random numbers, first to get a list of everyone in the population. Second, assign on each person a number. Third, generate the appropriate random numbers. Step 4, select participants or individuals corresponding with those random numbers. This is simple. This is the basic sampling process. In the systematic sampling, researchers select a sample in a little bit different way. First, we get a list of everyone in the population. That's the same with the simple random sampling. Assign each person a number. Then we calculate the skip number. A skip number is calculated by the population size divided by the sample size. Then we generate the random number between 1 and the skip number, and we can get an initial starting point or initial numbers between 1 and the skip number. Then from the initial number, we select every like tens or fifths of people in the sample. So this is how the systematic sampling is working. Another type of sampling is stratified random sampling. So in the stratified random sampling, the researchers first try to divide the population into homogeneous subgroups. And then we have several subgroups in the population. And in each subgroups, we conducted a sample random sampling and randomly select some number of people in each subgroup. This is the stratified random sampling. Last one is the cluster sampling. And cluster sampling is used if we don't have a list of 4 people, or when we could not get a list of everyone in the population. In this case, researchers conduct a cluster sampling, and in the cluster sampling, the researchers randomly select some of the groups. So we randomly select groups, clusters, or blocks. Then, in each selected groups or clusters or blocks, researchers survey all people in this kind of selected groups. This is how the cluster sampling is working. So in this way, by applying these 4 types of sampling, we can get unbiased sample. So for the exam, you have to think about and remember each characteristics of different types of sampling. And also in the lecture and the recitation, we talked about 4 levels of measurement, or 4 types of how to create survey questions in a simple way. So we talk about 4 things like nominal measure, ordinal measure, interval measure, and ratio measure. First, in the ordinal measure, the characteristics of the nominal measure is that there's no order between attributes. The attributes of the variables are simply distinct from one another. So let's think about the gender, male and female, or where I come from, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois. There's no order between these items. They are simply different or distinct from each other. That's the characteristics of nominal measure. Another type of measure is ordinal measure. And the characteristics of the ordinal measure is that attributes of the variables are logically ranked ordered, like strongly agree or strongly disagree. We can say that strongly agree shows or indicates higher levels of agreements than strongly agree. And that's the ordinal measure. Another type of measurements is interval measure. So in the interval measure, attributes of the variables are logically ranked ordered. And then in the interval measure, it makes sense to calculate between options. So distance among attributes has meaning, which means that we can do some calculations between options. And another characteristics of the interval measure is that it has no meaning for zero, which means that the zero value of the variable is very arbitrary, like temperature. What is the meaning of 0 degrees Fahrenheit? Is it feel nothing? But it is just arbitrarily, and the 0 has no meaning. Last one is ratio measure, and the characteristics of the ratio measure is that attributes of the variables are logically ranked ordered. Distance among attributes makes sense. So we can do some calculations between options. And the big characteristics of the ratio measure is that it has a meaningful 0, which means that 0 means nothing. So for example, what is the meaning of I have 0 money, which means that I don't have any money. Or I have 0 friends, which means that I don't have any friends. So the ratio measure, the 0 has some meaning, or 0 means nothing. So in this way, you need to think about and remind the characteristics of the 4 types of measurement, or 4 levels of measurement. And also we talk about validity and reliability. So we do a population, select a sample from a population. We create some survey questions, do the sampling, and then last one we have to think about how to construct and evaluate this measurement. So when social scientists construct and evaluate measurements, they have pay attention to 2 technical considerations. First one is validity, another one is reliability. First, validity is defined as a quality indicating that a measuring instrument accurately measures what it is intended to measure, which means that a measure, like survey questions, accurately reflect a concept, or a measure or the survey question should capture what they intend to measure. This is about the validity. So if I want to measure like happiness, the measure or survey question should only capture happiness, but the measure should not capture anger or depression. This is about what the validity. This is what the validity is about. And we talk about three types of validity: content validity, construct validity, and criterion validity. First, content validity refers to how much a measure covers a range of meanings included within the concept. So, for example, a test of mathematical ability cannot be limited to addition, but also needs to cover subtraction, multiplication, division, and so forth. So the group of expertise might see the measures and check whether the measure covers things that should be included and look at the measure. And if it looks okay, then we can say the measure has a content validity. Another type of measure is the construct validity. Construct validity refers to how the variable in the question should theoretically relate to other variable. The construct validity is based on the logical relationship between variables. So if it theoretically have some kind of relationship with others, then we can say it has a construct validity. The last one is the criterion validity, is about test. So basically, criterion validity refers to the degree to which a measure relates to some external criterion. So for example, scores on college board test is expected to predict the college success of the student, which means that if the students really did a good at college board test or university entrance exam, then we can expect that the students will succeed in the college. So researchers test whether the measurement really predict the success of students in the college, or whether the college board tests really have related to or predict the student success in the college. This is how the criterion validity is working. So in this way, you need to think about the definition of the validity and think about three types of validity. Another one is reliability. And reliability is about the consistency or stability in measurement. The reliability is a matter of whether a particular technique applied repeatedly to the same object produces the same result each time. So for example, I bought 10 apples at the market, and I want to know how much apples weigh. So as one technique, I use the scale to estimate the apples weight. So in the morning, the scale shows that it is 3 pounds. However, in the afternoon, I weigh the same amount of apple, but it shows that it is 10 pounds. But then it doesn't make any sense. So then we can conclude that the scale is wrong, or we can conclude that the technique of having scale estimate apples weight is not reliable because it does not produce the same result. So this is about reliability. Also in the lecture, we talk about three types of reliability, like test with test method, intercoder reliability, and inter-item reliability. So we talk about like how to create good questions. We have to think about reliability and validity, or 4 types of measurement. The last one, there's some kind of practical guide to make good survey questions we talk about in the lecture. So I just summarize several guidelines or things to think about when you create survey questions. First, when we create survey questions for behaviors specifically, we have to give a time period that is likely to be remembered. For example, when we ask people like, how many times did you use social media during last 10 years? That question doesn't make any sense because we cannot remember our social media use behavior 10 years ago. So we have to provide a specific time period that is likely to be remembered. And also, when we create survey questions, we have to think about social desirability, which means that we have to be careful when we make questions about socially desirable or undesirable behaviors or attitudes. So in other words, study participants have a tendency to answer to the questions in a way that makes them look good in the eyes of others, regardless of accuracy of their answers. So for example, most people would deny that they drive after drinking alcohol because it is not socially good, or others would most likely disapprove this behavior. So even though they drive after driving, in the survey question, they will not answer to the question accurately, and they will just say, I don't have any experience of driving after drinking. This is kind of issue with the social desirability, and we have to be careful when we ask questions related to this illegal or undesirable behaviors. And also we have to avoid double negatives when we create survey questions, which means that not to include two negative words because it could be confusing or misleading the participants. And also we have to avoid double-barreled questions, which means that researchers should ask only one question at a time. Do not ask two or three things in a one sentence. This is about avoiding double-barreled questions. And another guideline is that researchers should avoid overly long questions or avoid ambiguous terminologies or avoid leading phrases. And it is strongly recommended to use simple languages in the question. So these are the guidelines of how to make a good survey questions. So this is all about today. So good luck with your exam on Thursday. And just don't forget to bring pencils and student ID. Okay, so good luck with the exam and see you next week. Bye-bye.